Hello, everyone. Eleanor Beaton here. And today we are talking all about podcasts and podcasting. I'm really, really excited about this. So, I'm the founder of Safi Media. We are a media and education company on a mission to double the number of women founders who sustainably scale past $1 million in annual revenue. And the reason that we're doing this is because we really believe that women founders are key to advancing gender equity. So, a big part of that is the ability to share our stories. We can't be what we don't see. And so, the Power Presence Position podcast was founded more than 500 episodes ago to really be an opportunity to highlight stories about successful women leaders and founders, to offer practical insight. And quite frankly, it's one of the things in my business that I know I would absolutely do, even if I were not paid to do it. And technically, I'm not paid to do it, but also I kind of am. So I'm really looking forward to today's live stream. And this is really about celebrating 500 episodes and also sharing some of my biggest lessons from podcasting since 2016 and being a podcaster since 2016. And if you have any questions at all about podcasting, please go ahead. I'm happy to answer them. This is the time. This is not something I talk about normally, but because we're celebrating 500 episodes, this is a great time to have a conversation about podcasting and answer any and all questions that you have about it. And I will tell you, most podcasters do things a little differently. So I'm going to share. Hey, Becca, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm so pumped. I think the podcast was like maybe a year old when we were hanging out. So it's great to see you here. Okay, so 500 episodes. And yes, the podcast, by the way, is called Power Presence Position. Hey, Christina. Oh, thank you so much. I love seeing that. Christina's saying, I'm grateful for your podcast. It totally changed my mindset around doing business as a woman entrepreneur. I love that. And I'm so grateful. And I know the team that's been producing the podcast 500 episodes in is incredibly grateful. So first of all, I'll just share, having a podcast is a tremendous amount of dedication and commitment ahead of time. So what I mean by that is that you are going to be showing up when you have one download, when you have two downloads to the place, you're going to be showing up and putting in a lot of front end work to build an audience of listeners. So it's a tremendous amount of dedication and commitment. And I have put tons of hours in this chair. I've actually had the same office chair since I started. I put tons of hours in this exact chair over years, like since 2016, to produce the podcast. And initially, I was doing it with a much smaller audience than we have today. So yeah, just, a tremendous amount of dedication and commitment from myself. And also from many extraordinary people who have made this podcast possible over the years. And sort of that lineup has changed over time, but so many people have had a role in making this podcast excellent. And I really want to acknowledge those extraordinary people. Thank you, Becca. Sage and succinct. And you know what? That's the thing, right? And I feel as though that's huge. So Becca is like, I've got my tips here. This is my outline. And Becca says the podcast is sage and succinct, which is fantastic. So I'm going to go straight to my number 2 tip, or like the lesson that I've learned from podcasting, which is that, and I first sort of learned about this when I was in journalism school studying journalism, and I was obsessed with radio. Right. I was a CBC radio reporter. I was, produced radio documentaries. I was totally into radio because I loved the intimacy of the radio format, and today the podcasting format, which is one person, one voice. Right? We can connect when I'm listening to a podcast. I've got my earbuds in or my headphones and I'm listening to a voice, and it's just a really powerful connection. And it's a connection, that, for humans is huge, because we would hear in our mom's tummies, we would hear voices, right? So it's a very ancient connection, that sort of auditory connection. But here's the thing, and I think this is like the first lesson that I've learned. Nothing is more important than the bond that you have with your audience. Nothing is more important than the bond that you have with your audience. And I feel like when you think about that relationship, like it's a partnership with your audience, it's a partnership with your listeners. And I didn't get that at first. Like at first, when I was podcasting, it was really about sort of me finding my voice. And that's classic, in any kind of creation. Normally, it's more about the person who's creating it initially, and you're kind of testing things out, you're trying things. But as I matured as a podcaster, I realized it's all about the bond with the audience. And so let me give you an example of how that shows up. So initially in the podcast, my episodes where I was interviewing guests would have a lot more downloads. Today, my solo episodes have more downloads, which is really interesting. And that's not abnormal. In fact, what you'll find is that over time, it's the same on TV shows. Very often, like people are watching The View for the hosts much more so than the celebrity guests, right? Which is kind of an interesting phenomenon. But the bond with your audience is really important. And I've realized to be even more discerning over time about who comes onto the show, really making sure that the people that I'm bringing onto the show are able to show up with vulnerability, with courage, to not just be talking at people, but to be conversing with them, to really understand the women who are listening. Like, they're intelligent, they're smart, they don't need people telling them what to do. They're really looking for, practical insight, for my audience, guests to bring in information that is practical, relevant, and useful to these really smart powerhouse women in business who listen. So I have taken that on sort of more seriously as time has gone on. Just really understanding this bond with the audience is the most important thing. So I think that's really huge. And I think about, like, in any kind of partnership, how do I want to be showing up for this person? And, it's like, how can I do this intentionally? How can I, so it's not like, oh, you just have to go and record this podcast, but how can you always be really intentional about showing up? What kind of partner do you want to be to your listener? What are they going to be able to rely on you for? And what are they not going to be able to rely on you for? So for instance, like, I think about that in terms of format. So we definitely have some interviews, but mostly solos. If I all of a sudden only did interviews, that would be weird with the audience, right? Because they'd be like, wow, this, the bond that we've built is through sort of solo shows. And now all of a sudden, all you do is feature, conversations with other people. So that's a place where it doesn't mean I couldn't do it. I would just have to really talk with my audience and prepare them and explain why I'm making the shift or whatever. So I think that's really key, that it's all about building a connection with your audience and really thinking as a podcaster, how do I want to show up as a partner to my audience to really support them to grow, so that they can support you to grow your show. So that's one thing that I think is really key. The second lesson that I learned, so many of the podcasts that were around when I started are no longer around. And it's this idea of pod fade, right? And so because of the dedication that is required to produce a show consistently, over and over and over and week after week after week. Like, it's just a tremendous amount of dedication, right? So one of the biggest reasons that podcasts are not successful is pod fade. Like, people just kind of get tired of producing a podcast. And P.S., there's nothing wrong with that. Like, there's nothing that says the fact that you start a podcast means you have to continue it ad nauseum. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So if a podcast isn't producing results for you, if you don't enjoy it, if it doesn't bring you joy, I am all about consistency and discipline, but I'm not about stupidity, right? So if it doesn't, there's nothing wrong with trying it out, and I encourage people to try it out. Give it a good shot, give it a good shot. And you certainly don't have to continue it if you don't want to. But I will say, like, over the years, there's definitely been times where maybe I was tired or I didn't have a lot of time. And I just, producing a podcast that day was not the thing that I most wanted to do. And I really had to learn to work with that. But there's never actually been a time that I didn't value the podcast or didn't want to show up for it. So that's kind of key. So one thing I'll share about pod fade. I think the key thing here, if you are going to create a podcast, is that, in order to, you're going to be putting a lot into it. So, in order to do that, I would love for you to give yourself the gift of inspiration, that your show inspires you, that the topic and the focus of your show is big enough that it can inspire you, and it's focused enough that it produces business results for you. So, I'm going to share a little bit more about the business results piece in a moment, but let's talk about big enough. So, what I would say is that now some people have podcasts that are super niched in and very, very specific all around only kind of what they sell. So, an example would be if I made my podcast, the only thing that we talked about was specific, let's say, well, I would never do this, but let's say an example of that might be the group program podcast. So this is the podcast where you come to learn all about running group programs. You know what I mean? And so, P.S., that would be a great podcast, but for something like that, you might find that it's so specific and so niched in that it doesn't actually inspire me. Like, I don't actually want to be producing the same podcast in 5 different ways over and over and over. So, and Rose is saying, give yourself the gift of inspiration, right? Absolutely. So what I would say, what I chose to do was to build a podcast around our mission. Because the mission, so it's really about advancing gender equity, one woman-owned business at a time. And I know that our piece of that is really, and what I'm interested in listening to is really practical, no fluff insight. Like, give me the real raw stories, give me the practical, no fluff insight. That I knew would inspire me over time. And so it's always been about gender equity and advancing gender equity. And now it's really about sort of building that around like one woman-owned business at a time. So that's been really key. And I would really encourage you to think about how you might build a podcast around a mission. Because I think as a listener, because what you're looking for are really to create loyal listeners over time. And so you want it to be both focused enough that it gives them practical tools, but also big enough that the intrigue is there and that they keep coming back. So that's been sort of key for me. But second of all, of course, related to it has to be big enough and broad enough to inspire you. The second part is that it needs to produce actual business results. So there were like earlier on in my career as a podcaster, I was building audience. It was all good, but I really was producing content from my journalism days. And as a journalist, all I had to do was focus on telling a story. And I had there was management of of CBC radio, of the Globe and Mail newspaper, there were managers, there were sales and advertising departments, there were revenue generators. So I only had to do this one little piece, which was tell a story, right? And that was fantastic. P.S. I loved it. But as a podcaster, I approached the initial podcasting like that. And so what was happening is that the podcast was awesome. It was totally building my audience, but I did wonder at times, is this a really expensive time producing hobby? Is this really generating, am I missing out on opportunities? And I can remember having people like friends and advisors saying, you should be selling harder on the show. And I just blithely ignored them, not because their insight wasn't sound, but because the way that they were talking about doing it was more like creating commercials. And I didn't really want to do that either. So it took a while for me to really understand how to truly monetize the podcast. So I have never had sponsors really. Actually, I've had one sponsor one time for a series of episodes, but outside of that, I've always considered Safi Media to be the sponsor of the Power Presence Position podcast. And what I learned is that really you want to be strategic about your content. And you want to be strategic about connecting the content that you talk about to the things that you sell in a thoughtful way that never breaks the bond with your audience. So what I mean, and my rule around this is just that it's always better to be clear than to be clever. right? And because it's this bond with the audience, always just being frank and upfront. So I might be talking about something in the podcast, and I might say, and by the way, this is something that I teach in more depth in the Power Presence Position Business Accelerator. And if you're a loyal listener of the show, you may want to consider coming into one of our paid programs. So I might say it like that. And it's very respectful. It's woven in, but I'm also, the reason that you could even bring that up authentically is because you're ensuring that some of the content that you create is connected to what you sell. And P.S., if it's not, if none of your content is connected to what you sell, maybe you should be selling something different. Like maybe you're not selling the right thing. Maybe the things that you're selling, you're not passionate enough about, And so I have had to ask myself all of these questions. So I think that's kind of the second lesson. I think that for a time, the podcast was in an odd way, sort of an expensive hobby in the first year or two, because I hadn't yet mastered the art of choosing and curating the content that we produced to make sure that it aligned with business goals. That is a sophisticated skill. It is about positioning. It is about clarity of your business model. And that takes time. So I guess the kind of fourth lesson that I've learned is that it's connected to all of these. They sort of build on one another, is that your podcast is an amplifier, right? So your podcast amplifies your message. And it's like anything. If your message isn't clear, if your offerings aren't clear, if your business model isn't clear, your podcast will amplify all of those things. So I think that, to really maximize the podcast, what I have learned is that you want to ensure that you are so clear as a founder. Here's who I'm here to serve. Here's what I offer. Here are the core reasons why you would engage in this offer. Here are the things that, we talk about. Here are some of the problems that people have, in order for them to take us up on this offer, that kind of thing. And just to be so clear about the inner world of your business and the inner workings of your business so that you can simply communicate that to your audience in a clear, respectful way that nurtures and builds that relationship. So again, earlier on, and I can remember really experiencing this as I decided to stop serving the corporate market and only work with women founders. So I made that decision. And at that time, so my business model, there's a time where you want to be here. You don't want to be where you are. And there's that liminal space where you're not fully over here and you're not fully over here either. And I remember during that space, the podcast, I didn't market anything. I was just kind of having conversations and putting out the best content I could, but the podcast wasn't actually driving any business results for us because the internal part of the business still wasn't quite clear enough. I had to give that space to make that transition. So, your podcast will amplify your business. And so the more you can ensure that your business is clear, the better it's going to be. And then I think the fifth thing, and this is something that I've been talking about quite a bit lately, is that, now more than ever, the bar for quality content is getting set higher and higher and higher. And I think as any of us content creators, really saw this after COVID. So COVID fueled an explosion in digital marketing. Right? It really fueled an explosion in digital marketing and in digital content. And, one of my clients was showing me, drawing to my attention, the Edelman Thought Leadership Report, which showed that because of the glut in content, that now everybody has a blog, everybody has a podcast, people are producing. And I think that's a great thing, by the way. This is not me being a Luddite. I think that's a really good thing. I think if anything, what we've also learned in the past few years is that we would benefit from having more and diverse voices leading conversations and participating in conversations. So this is a good thing. And related to the fact that there is an increase, in content out there, one of the things that's happened is that there's a lot of mediocre and average content, because the fact that you can talk into a mic does not mean that you're actually going to be a person who can produce a quality podcast, right? That takes time. It's definitely a skill. And so Edelman in their thought leadership report found that the glut of post-COVID content, digital content, actually has diminished the perceived value of thought leadership. And I would say I'm a firm believer that there's always plenty of room at the top, always. And that there will always be smart people out there who are really looking for great quality content that's produced specifically for them. I can remember starting within the last 18 months, friends reaching out to me and being like, what are you listening to? Because I'm not finding podcasts. I'm just tired of everything. I feel like everything sucks, And so they had a point to that for sure. So I think, the one thing that I would share too is that really kind of thinking through quality content. And I think what is quality content? To me, it has everything to do with who your listeners are, what they want, how you can add to their life, what they're really listening for. Are they listening to be taught? Or are they listening to be inspired? Are they listening for connection? Are they listening to be inspired through your example? And I think every podcaster is going to have a different relationship with their audience. And therefore, what quality looks like to you and to your audience, which is the most important thing. It's your audience who defines quality. I think there's an interplay between you, your definition of quality, and your audience's definition of quality. And where those things match, that's the quality podcast, right? And so I think, really taking time to understand that. There are a couple of principles, and one is really how to effectively create and communicate concepts and principles. And again, I think that's the selling with story framework. I always go back to that. So I'm so passionate about really making sure that everybody has the basic tools that you need to be able to communicate your ideas in a way that command attention. They get retention. People remember what you said. They retain the information, and you're able to communicate with intention, so you can clearly lay out what they need to do next, right? Attention, retention, intention, RE. When you are able to communicate like that, it's really powerful. And it's honestly one of the oldest forms, storytelling. It's one of the oldest forms of communication out there. So I put as an outline, I don't even have to consciously do this anymore. Like 500 episodes in, it just works this way, that all of our podcast episodes are really laid out around this concept of selling with story. So I have the framework. It's free. Just go to eleanorbeaton.com/story, and you can get that framework, eleanorbeaton.com/story, and you get the selling with story framework. It's free. It's a really powerful tool. Okay. So there's some questions. Just hang on. Okay. Where is it? Hang on. No, it's in Slack, I think. Right? Hang on. Let me see. There's questions here. Okay. Okay. Yes. Michelle's saying it's so easy to get stuck and there's so many others doing it. Why bother? Agreed, and I 100%. And I think I see that. I have always seen that as both, when I'm in the right mindset around it, I've always seen that as both like a challenge in a good way, and also like, a reality. So here's what I mean by that. Yeah, there is a lot out there. And so, so in that world, typically who is going to be favored? The incumbents, so people who've been doing it potentially for a while, although they could be losing market share too, or people who are just super well connected. And so I think that's where, one of my favorite expressions is yours might be the only gospel that your person is able to hear. So very often our ability to hear something is a lot about where we are, but it also has a lot to do with who's saying it. And so there could be things, Michelle, that you teach or offer that somebody else is offering the same or saying the same thing, but that person could only hear it when you said it. I don't know, for those of you guys who have kids, like sometimes, it's like you're saying and saying and saying to your kid, and then somebody else says it, and it's like, all of a sudden, eureka, they couldn't hear your gospel, but they could hear somebody else's gospel. So I hold that saying close to me all the time. Hey, Eleanor, your gospel might be the only one that certain people in your audience are capable of hearing. And if you don't say it, they won't get this. And so you've got to say it. So I've kind of used that, definitely for myself so many times. Okay, so let me just check. Okay, perfect. All right. Thank you. Thank you for the congrats. Okay, so I hope this has been super helpful to all of you. So just to recap, so number one, pod fade is real. I learned that. And so really make sure that as you're choosing a podcast, you're choosing a focus for your show that really inspires you so that you have the ability to have longevity. And again, not everything, you don't have to, the fact that you start a podcast does not mean you need to keep it going to 500 episodes. That's not at all, you shouldn't, I don't think that should be a big burden for you to have to do that. But I definitely value consistency and dedication. And I think as you put in the work, it really benefits over time. Number two, your bond with your audience is everything. It's everything, like I am so protective about that bond in a constructive way, in the sense that I really ask myself, really make sure like they're giving me the gift of their time. And so I want to make sure, and they're trusting me that I'm going to make sure that bringing into the world of this podcast it's only good stuff. Right. So and it's really the key is to kind of balancing that without being a perfectionist. Be strategic about creating content that connects to what you sell in a thoughtful way. And that really is the key. It's actually not super easy to do. There are nuances to it, but I think that's sort of key. The third, your podcast amplifies your business. So if your business isn't clear, what's going to happen is that will be amplified through the show. And it doesn't, so your podcast can easily become an expensive hobby if you're not careful. And then finally, the caliber for content is getting higher and higher. So really being thoughtful and using tools to help you be a more effective storyteller, a more effective podcaster. And I think we've got one tool that's really helpful. It's called the Selling with Story Framework. You can get it at eleanorbeaton.com/story. All right. Thank you so much. If you've benefited from the podcast, I would so love if you could leave us a review. It's so helpful. So go ahead and leave us a review on your favorite podcast player. And again, a huge thank you to everybody who's been a part of this show over time. If you know of somebody who's thinking about starting a show or a podcast and who might get some value out of this live, please don't hesitate to share it with them or tag them in the comments so that they can watch. All right, guys, have a beautiful rest of the day. We'll talk to you soon. Bye, everyone.